Hello and welcome to TTF's Learning Matters, a podcast where we discuss all matters related to learning. Well, we're saying learning, but it's actually gaps in learning in the wake of the long pandemic that has teachers in schools all over the world tied up in knots. What's a learning gap? I think something that we call a disparity between what a student has actually learned and what he or she is expected to learn at a particular grade. So in other words, it's the gap between the expected and the actuals in terms of learning. So what do we do to bridge this gap? Should there be short-term measures, long-term measures? To discuss this with us, we have two very dynamic educators who have demonstrated remarkable leadership. Of course, even much before the pandemic, but during and post the pandemic, there was some exemplary leadership because of which their respective teams not just tided over the vagaries of the pandemic, but are now making a seamless transition back to school. We're delighted to have with us Rekha Chari, Head of Elementary Curriculum and Advocacy and Outreach at Mallya Aditi International School, and Vijai Rajagopal, Director, Vidyaniketan Public School. Both of these schools are based in Bangalore. Welcome to this podcast, Rekha and Vijay.
Thank you for having both of us. I'm speaking on behalf of Rekha as well.
Thank you, Vijay. Thank you for having us, Sandhya.
So first off, it's been maybe about a few weeks in this academic session, but this academic session has started in the in-person mode. So from March 2020 to almost Feb 2022, schools, at least in Bangalore, were forced to go online, then offline, then hybrid, almost a hodgepodge, as it were. So what do you see as the major impact of this COVID-induced interruption on school education overall and on your school in particular?
So we were able to fortunately hit the ground running when we had to shut school and go online, because we were already using technology, so to say, when school was in person. So just going online just required us to probably sign up for certain video conferencing tools and LMSs, learning management systems. But that also we were able to quickly identify because we were kind of already into it. It was an exciting time actually, although there was much tension outside about the pandemic itself, about the COVID. But we were very excited that these were new realms that we were entering. How would we do this? We used to stay up 10, 12 hours, and stay up late night working, figuring out logistics, and really exciting times for us. And it did work out well. I think what that time also taught us was systematic approach, systematic training of teachers, systematically approaching parents and students. So it really aligned our thoughts. We put that into practice and we were very, very proud of ourselves. So that time, the beginning of the pandemic, worked well for us. And then, of course, reality hit us when we did have to conduct classes, and then the government saying yes and the government saying no, pulling out. So that was a lot of confusion. But then it did become the new norm, and it almost became organic to us how we conducted classes online and how we also stepped up and understood how this would work, understood it from students' perspectives, their socio-emotional perspective, not just the cognition, but understood so much more and comprehended so much more about learning and what learning is about. Is it the knowledge? Is it the skills, the attitudes, which we speak about so easily and fluently all the time, but all that was challenged and put to test. It was a good ride though. And coming back has been difficult, but we were prepared, I think, because we knew, I think I'll talk about that later, when I shared my experience of the school about students returning, what were the difficulties and challenges that we faced and are still trying to overcome.
I'm glad that, Mallya Aditi school, you said you had, I think, a much easier ride. I think
yes.
A lot because of your preparedness. Yeah. Vijay, what is your take? What has been the impact that you have seen?
Some of what I have to say may sound repetitive because schools that have done well for themselves have done things that are very similar in nature. When the announcement of the pandemic became more public, indeed for a school of our size, where we have more than 4,000 students, there was that moment where every one of us would have thought about how are we going to accomplish learning, especially when we don't get to see students in a face-to-face mode in the classrooms. But I do agree with Rekha in the sense that for learning to manifest in the way it does, progressive schools have always needed to make investments into technology, and not just investments, but also learn how to use technology for impact. And we are also fortunate to have a team of educators who understood the importance of that. I don't intend to say that there were no adjustments that were necessary. Of course, we had to adjust. Of course, we had to learn. Of course, we had to understand the difficulty of speaking into a screen and hoping that children would learn. So those kinds of adjustments, had to be done as teachers. But what is surprising is even teachers with little or no technology background, they may have been trained, right? They may have gone through the courses which enable them to use technology. But there have been occasions even in schools when they did not have to use it in the manner that was expected of them when the pandemic hit. But what's surprising is even those teachers took it up as a challenge and ensured that they learned on the fly, right? They did not want that kind of disparity to be seen between one teacher and the other. And for the student, one would want to believe that it was seamless enough in terms of how the classroom transaction went about. I know you will have many more questions about the way in which students learned and whether they learned at all. It's not a zero-sum game. I feel there have been instances when students have learned, but that also depended on the kind of activities and engagement that the teachers had planned for them. When we say this, we have to understand that there are limitations to technology also. And all the educators in my school, and one would presume that in all progressive schools, have really done well for themselves. And like Rekha said, the reality sinks back in when children are coming back to schools. But as far as our school was concerned, whenever the government opened the channels for children to come back, we welcomed them back to school. And at least towards the end of the academic year, I think we had at least 6 to 8 weeks when the children were in school. So we were amongst the schools that kept the doors open and welcomed the children. So it gave us some amount of insight into the extent to which students have learned, what have they learned, what have they not learned, what are they struggling with. And it was also a welcome relief for the students. So that is my take on how the 2 years went by.
Remarkable the way your school, you're talking of a strength of 4,000, of students, and the way your school adapted and how quickly they did it. So I'm kudos to you and your team, Vijay.
If I may just add to Vijay's thoughts, it just brought, leadership mattered at this time. Leadership really mattered where those of us who were leading teams and who were, getting the teachers going and getting them into that mode, we all stepped in. And from the principal to every teacher, stepped up and worked. And like Vijay said, it wasn't easy. It wasn't as seamless as we say it was. It was sitting up at 10:30, 11. And there are some teachers who were challenged, who would call you, and your patience as somebody who could lead these people, doubled over time. And empathy. We talk about that word so easily, but you really stepped in and you started experiencing what it meant to be patient, to put yourselves in that person's shoes and say, what are her challenges? I say her because most teachers being women, and what about their, everybody was cooped up at home, the entire family was at home. So it was completely different circumstance now. You were juggling roles. So like Vijay said, to students, it may have seemed seamless, but for teachers, it has been difficult, and the learning curve has been super steep. But people have stepped up and done it. And today they are empowered because they are ready to face school online, offline, either ways. They're, up to speed with the technology in terms of education.
Yep.
Just one point, because the conversation is indeed getting interesting. See, for the teachers also, the challenge was manifold, right? On the one hand, you have opened up your classroom to the entire parental fraternity, where, everything is evident out there. But the situation back home is also not entirely conducive. Up till today, you have never had the need to have your spouse, your partner, or anybody else in the house witness how you actually teach. Now, to me, it's like double jeopardy, right? But people had to overcome those, inhibitions and fears. That, I think, was far more challenging than the competence that they already had with regards to the subjects that they teach, right? I think that was also something that they had to really win over in order to be effective and in order to convince themselves that they could do it.
On a lighter note, you knew that so-and-so's maid came at 9:00 because she would be just sweeping and mopping, and after you could just set your watch according to that, and it just became the new normal. It was perfectly okay for somebody to walk in the background. It was perfectly okay for somebody to just sneak in a cup of milk, and students just going out of the screen to sip as if we couldn't see them. But all that slowly, I think even we kind of relaxed a little bit and came to understand that this happens. The pressure cooker screaming in the background, it was all okay. So that was so nice to be able to engage in this formal education, in this thing, but also to have a very normal life. And for, like Vijay said, even for students to understand that teachers also have a life really beyond school, that they also are normal people with children screaming in the background and, things happening. So that, how things became so normal after some time. Nobody was shy of switching off their cameras because somebody was walking past. It was all right.
Yeah. I mean, it's so glad to hear what you're saying, because it's like what could have been construed as this great adversity became this great opportunity, for learning, for enabling, for development of skills, and I think bonding in other ways, as you're saying, Rekha.
True.
Right? It's been great talking to both of you, Vijay and Rekha. Your points and your perspectives have been so interesting. It's going to give our listeners a lot of new ideas. Thank you both so much for being a part of this podcast.
In our next podcast, we continue our discussion with Rekha Chari and Vijai Rajagopal, where we analyze the reasons for these learning gaps. Stay tuned.